To Miss Theodosia Lanyon, at the Parsonage Schoolroom in the parish of Nethercompton, Dorsetshire, these from the office of Wraysbury and Penaluna, solicitors of Boscawen Street, Truro, in the county of Cornwall, this 14th day of September, in the year of our Lord 1819. Madam, it is my office to acquaint you, with such gravity and such respect as the occasion demands, that your great-uncle, Mr. Jago Tregenna, gentleman, of Tregenna Watch, in the parish of St. Sonara by the cliff upon the north coast of this county, departed this life upon the 3rd day of the present month, in the 79th year of his age, peacefully and in possession of his faculties, and that under his last will and testament. Proved before me, and now lodged in the registry, you are named his sole heiress. I am sensible that this intelligence will reach you as a stranger reaches a door, and I ask your pardon that I had not the means of reaching you sooner, the late gentleman having kept the degrees of his kindred close, and the connection between his line and your own having lain unspoken these 40 years. I have the honour to be, Madam, your most obedient and faithful servant, Josiah Wraysbury. And then, beneath the letter and folded within the same packet, sealed in green wax with a device of a sun in eclipse, the clauses of the will itself, copied out in a clerk's upright hand, I, Jago Tregenna, being of sound mind and disposing memory, though declining in body, do give, devise, and bequeath unto my great niece Theodosia Lanyon, daughter of my late sister Honour, all that my messuage and estate called Tregenna Watch, together with the octagonal observatory and all instruments astronomical and horological therein contained, the turret clock of my own making, with its movement, its dial, its bells, and the house that shelters it, the workshop, with its benches, its half-finished movements, its weights and bobs and graduated brass, the freehold of the whole, with the home farm and its acres, and the sum of £4,200 in the 3% consolidated annuities, to the intent that the said estate, the said clock, and the observing of the heavens from the said tower may be maintained and continued after me. And I name as the reason of this my bequest that which I have written privately and left in the strong-box of my workshop, to be read by her and by no other. The packet had come up from Truro by the morning mail, and lain an hour on the deal table by the schoolroom window before anyone thought to carry it across the lane. For the carrier had not known there was a Miss Lanyon at the parsonage school, and had asked first at the church. So it was that the letter naming her heiress to a cliff and a clock she had never seen, from an old man she had been taught to think no more real than a figure in a fireside tale, reached Theodosia Lanyon at the precise minute she had least leisure to attend to it, for she was, at that hour, occupied with the business of the meridian, and would not be moved from it for any packet in the kingdom until the business was done. The schoolroom faced south, a low whitewashed room with a row of sash windows and a slate floor worn pale at the doorway, and along the southernmost sill she had set, weeks before, a thin upright of black painted wood with a fine vertical thread drawn taut down its face, a poor man's meridian mark of her own devising, fixed so that at the moment of the sun's noon passage its shadow would fall true along a chalk line she had scored into the boards. She stood now at the sash with her watch open in her left palm, a silver open-faced pocket watch on a thin steel chain at her waist, and her observing notebook propped against the frame, and she did not look at the children, who had learned across 2 terms that when Miss Lanyon kept the noon she was not to be addressed. A composed Englishwoman of 28, in a half-mourning gown of dove-grey wool with a folded cream fichu at the bosom and a grey wool spencer buttoned to the throat, She watched the chalk line and the creeping shadow with the whole of her attention gathered to a point, her grey-blue eyes moving once to the watch face and once to the thread, and back again, her lips parting only to count under her breath the seconds her ear had learned to keep without a beat to guide it. There is a particular pleasure, known to very few and confessed by fewer, in the keeping of a true noon, in standing at the threshold of the actual instant when the sun crosses the meridian of one's own scrap of the turning earth, and catching it and writing it down, so that for one ruled line, in one ruled book the heavens and a woman's watch agree exactly. Theodosia Lanyon had felt that pleasure perhaps 400 times in her life and had never grown tired of it, and she felt it now. The morning's packet forgotten on the deal behind her, the children forgotten, everything in the room narrowed to the slow black crawl of the shadow toward the chalk and the soft swing of the seconds, her own pulse and her own counting kept between them. The shadow touched the line. She marked the watch, 11 minutes and some seconds past the hour by London time, which was the parsonage clock's pretension. The parsonage clock being 3 minutes and a half fast and falling further fast each week, as she had told the curate twice and would tell him a third time, and as he had each time agreed and then done nothing. Being a man who believed, with the larger part of the parish, that a clock was right if it agreed with the other clocks, and could not be brought to see that a roomful of clocks agreeing on a falsehood was a falsehood multiplied, and not a truth. She wrote the figure into the ruled column under the date, closed the watch with her thumb, and only then turned her head and saw the boy from the carrier's cart standing in the doorway, with the packet held out in both hands, and the look of one who has been told to wait, and has waited the length of an eternity. "You have kept the noon with me," she said to him, not unkindly. That was well done. Set it on the desk. He set it on the desk and fled. She finished her column first. She ruled the line beneath the day's entry, blotted it, and laid the notebook flat with its brass-cornered cover open to dry, and only when the ink had taken did she draw the packet to her across the deal and turn it to read the direction, and saw her own name in a Truro clerk's hand, and the green seal with the eclipsed sun, and weighed in her other hand the second thing that had come wrapped within the oilcloth, a key. It was a winding key, heavy, of dark old brass, longer than her hand from the bow to the squared tip, the kind of key that turns no door, but rather the great barrel of a turret movement. And it was worn bright on the inside of the bow where 40 years of one man's grip had polished it, and cold, and heavier than it looked. She held it a moment in her cupped palm before she broke the seal. Across the room the children had gone still in the manner of children who know that something has happened to a grown person and are waiting to learn its weather. The eldest girl, Susan Croker, 11 and sharp, half rose from the bench. Theodosia put out the hand that held the key, palm down, the old schoolmistress's gesture for sit, and Susan sat. Then she read the letter through once, from the date to Josiah Raisbury's faithful service, without haste and without a word, and read the clauses of the will through once after it. The messuage and the observatory and the instruments, astronomical and horological, the turret clock of my own making, the £4,200 in the consoles, and she did not weep, and she did not gasp, and the only outward sign that the morning had altered under her was that she set the key down upon the deal with a care she had not used in picking it up, as though it had grown, in the reading, into a thing not to be knocked against the wood. Great Uncle Jago. She had the name, she had always had the name. It was the substance she had been denied. Her mother had spoken of a Cornish great-uncle perhaps 4 times in Theodosia's whole girlhood, and always in the way one speaks of a county one will never visit, a clever, queer old man away on the far cliffs who made clocks and watched the moon, and had quarrelled in some unspecified ancient manner with the whole of his blood, so that the line had let go of him, as one lets go of a kite string in a high wind, and watch the bright thing dwindle and turn its back on it forever. A family fiction, her aunt had called him once, with a sniff. There is no such uncle, Theodosia. Or if there ever was, he is 40 years dead, and good riddance, and you are not to romance about cliffs. And Theodosia, who had been a child too sensible to romance about anything she could not measure, had filed the queer old clockmaker away among the other improbable furniture of the family's talk, and had not thought of him in years, except she now understood with a particular inward stillness, except that she had grown into the very habit the fiction was said to have kept. For she too watched the moon. She too kept a ruled book of its phases and its risings, of the eclipses she had observed through the parson's borrowed glass, of the transits she could compute and the few she had been awake and clear-skied enough to see. She too could not abide a clock that lied, and had regulated, in her time, the parsonage long case, the church turret, the curate's own watch, and 3 of the better clocks in the houses of the parish, by ear and by the sun, asking no fee but the loan of a book. She had supposed this an oddity of her single self, a spinster's harmless mathematics. She saw now, with the green seal open under her hand, and the heavy key warming slowly in the room's air, that it might be an inheritance older than the consoles. That somewhere on a Cornish headland a man she had never met had been keeping the same noons, in the same way, for the half-century she had been alive, and learning to keep them, and that he had known of her, somehow where she had not known of him, and that he had left her his cliff. She dismissed the school early. There was no help for it. The morning was past mending for arithmetic. And besides, she found she wished the room emptied of small witnesses while she sat with the thing. She heard the catechism through to the end of the line they had reached, set the elder children their copying for the morrow, distributed the bread and dripping that 3 of the poorer ones had instead of a dinner, and let them out into the pale early autumn light of the lane. And Susan Croker turned at the gate to look back at her with frank curiosity, and was not rebuked for it. Then Theodosia Lanyon sat down again at the deal table in the emptied schoolroom, with the dust of the chalk still on her fingers and the meridian thread still hanging in the south sash, and she read the solicitor's letter a second time, and a third, slowly, the way she read an almanac, attending now not to the news of it, but to the joins. "The reason of this, my bequest," the will said, "that which I have written privately and left in the strong-box of my workshop, to be read by her, and by no other." So there was a reason, and it was written down, and it was waiting in a box, on a cliff, for her hand to lift it, that a man should leave a stranger £4,000, and a tower and the labour of his life, and leave with it a sealed account of why. That was not the act of a sentimental old fool romancing about cliffs. That was the act of a man who had chosen, deliberately, after consideration, and who meant the chosen one to understand the choosing. She found she respected it before she understood it. There was a discipline in it that answered something in her own disciplined nature, the way one well-cut wheel answers the teeth of its neighbour and turns it without slip or shudder. For she had spent her own life refusing to be moved by anything she had not first measured, and here, it seemed, was a man dead on a cliff who had spent his refusing the same. She found, too, turning the heavy key over in the light from the south window, that her hands were entirely without tremor, and she remarked the fact to herself with neither pride nor surprise, only the attentiveness she would have given to a clock that kept its rate through a change of weather. She was not overset. She was clear. A woman of less government might have sat down upon the bench and given way to the wonder of it, to the £4,000 that would lift her in a single morning out of the genteel poverty she had worn so long it had stopped chafing, might have wept for the strangeness, or written at once to every relation who had ever pitied her, or gone giddy among the impossible new furniture of the future. Theodosia did none of these. She had been poor too long, and too sensibly, to mistake money for safety or a windfall for a friend, and she knew besides that a gift of this magnitude, falling on a woman alone and unprotected, would draw to it, as surely as a warm grate draws the cold air of a whole house, the attention of persons who would think a parsonage schoolmistress an easy thing to dispossess. She did not yet know their names. She did not doubt for an instant that they existed. The thing required answering, and she would answer it. That evening, in her own narrow lodging above the wheelwrights at the end of the lane, by the light of a single tallow dip and with the winding key laid before her on the table beside the inkstand, she wrote her reply to Mr. Raysbury, and it was 3 sentences long, and the third of them was the only one that mattered. She thanked him for the discharge of an office that could not have been agreeable, and signified her acceptance, in due form, of the trust her great-uncle had reposed in her. She begged leave to be informed of such legal steps as the proving and the conveyance might yet require of her, and assured him she would attend to each without delay. And then, because she was who she was and could no more have left the question unasked than left a column unruled, she wrote, "I have one inquiry only, sir, which you will think a strange one, but which I must put before any other. My late great-uncle being, as his will declares, a maker of clocks and an observer of the heavens, I should be glad to know whether his observing records, his logged transits, his noted eclipses, his book of the daily rate of the turret movement are preserved among the effects of the estate, and whether they pass to me entire. For if they do, then I am his heir in more than the freehold, and if they do not, then no £4,000 will make good the loss." She read it over, found it honest, and did not soften it. It was not the inquiry a prudent woman would have set above the question of the conveyance and the consols, and she knew it, and she let it stand at the head of all the rest, because it was the truth of what she felt, and she would not begin a correspondence with the man who held her great-uncle's affairs by pretending to feelings she had not got. Let Mr. Raysbury of Boscawen Street think her odd. Half the parish of Nethercompton thought her odd, and she had found across 28 years that the opinion cost her nothing, and bought her a useful quantity of peace. A woman who is known to keep noons and regulate clocks and decline to romance about cliffs is a woman the world leaves. On the whole, alone and being left alone, Theodosia had long since decided, was a condition with much to recommend it, and very little understood. She sealed the letter and set it by the door for the morning mail, and sat a while longer with the key in her 2 hands, looking not at the dip flame but past it, at the dark square of the window where, had the night been clear, the early stars would by now have stood over the Dorset hills. And she thought of a cliff she had never seen, and a slit cut in a tower roof to let the meridian through, and a long case regulator ticking out the true seconds against the north wall of a room built for nothing in the world but the keeping of accurate time and the watching of an honest sky, and she found that she was not afraid of it, and not dismayed by it, and not, as a more conventional woman of 28 might have been, in any flutter over the consols or the freehold or the queerness of a stranger's gift. She was, if the truth be told, impatient. She wanted to see the clock. She wanted to read the rate book and learn whether the old man had kept his movement true to the second across the seasons, as she suspected a man who chose his heir by her arithmetic would have done. She wanted, more than she would have owned to the curate or her aunt or to anyone living, to open the strongbox in the workshop and read, in a dead man's private hand, the reason he had reached across 40 years of a quarrel she had never been party to, past every nearer and more proper claimant. To settle his cliff and his clock and his stars upon a parsonage schoolmistress he had never met. By the time the dip had burned to its socket, she had resolved the whole matter as plainly as she resolved a column of figures. She would write to her aunt, who would disapprove, and to the rector, who would release her from the school at quarter day with a character and his blessing and a good deal of curiosity. She would settle her few accounts in Nether Compton, which were soon settled, being few. And then, before the autumn was much older, before the equinoctial gales had got up along that far coast and made the roads west a misery, she would take the heavy brass key that had turned no door in her hand for the whole of an evening, and she would carry it the length of 3 counties to the place it belonged, and turn it, herself, in the lock it was cut for. The arrangements took her a little under a fortnight to settle, and she made them with the same unhurried method she brought to the regulation of a clock. She gave the school its proper notice, set her ledgers in order, packed 2 corded trunks and a small hand-case, and wrapped the heavy brass winding key in a square of flannel, and laid it at the very top of the case where her hand could find it, for she had taken a quiet fancy to the weight of it, and meant to keep it near. On a grey morning in the first week of the new month, she took her place in the mail coach at the inn yard, her notebook in her lap and the silver watch ticking against her waist, and watched the familiar streets give way to hedgerow and ploughland, and then to the long brown sweep of the Western Road. She had never travelled so far before, yet she found in herself no flutter, only a steady, attentive curiosity, the same temper with which she would have followed a planet across the meridian wire. The coach jolted and swayed. The 4 horses leaned into their collars on the rising ground and were given their heads on the foals, and Theodosia, who could not abide an idle hour, occupied herself by timing the changes of the team against her watch, noting the smartness of one ostler and the dawdling of another, and observing how the church clocks of the towns they passed kept their hours, one a full minute slow, one striking 13 by some fault of its locking plate, one so true she suspected it had been set by a careful hand within the week. She wrote these small judgments in her notebook, in her small upright hand, less because they signified anything than because the recording of true things steadied her, as it had always done. They broke their first fast at a low whitewashed inn where the coffee was thin and the bread excellent, and she ate with composure among strangers, declining to be drawn into the loud opinions of a wool factor who held forth upon the price of everything and the worth of nothing. By the long afternoon the country had begun to change beneath the wheels. The hedges grew higher and stonier, banked with earth and crowned with wind-bent thorn, and the fields narrowed into small irregular closes walled with grey granite, and the light itself took on a paler, wider quality, as though the sea were somewhere near and lending its brightness to the sky. She could not yet see it, but she fancied she could smell it on the changing air at the window, a clean, mineral sharpness under the dust of the road. They lay that night at a posting-house in a market town, and she was given a small clean room under the eaves with a window that looked west, and before she slept she opened the casement and leaned out into the cold and looked up. The clouds had broken. There, low over the rooftops, hung a fat gibbous moon, 3 or 4 nights past the full, and she regarded it with the unsentimental affection of long acquaintance, noting the slight blunting of its eastern limb where the shadow had begun to encroach, and she took out her notebook by the light of her single candle and set down the date, the hour, the phase, and the clearness of the sky, exactly as she had done on 1,000 nights before in 100 meaner lodgings. It pleased her, obscurely, that the moon at least was the same here as at home. and would be the same again over whatever cliff she was bound for, the heavens did not trouble themselves with the geography of probate. She reached Truro in the middle of the following morning, stiff and travel-worn but clear-eyed, and went directly, as she had been bidden, to the chambers of Mr. Wraysbury in a narrow street near the cathedral works. The solicitor received her himself, rising from behind a desk stacked with Japan deed boxes, and she found him much as his letter had led her to expect. Mr. Wraysbury, 61, a Truro solicitor in plain black superfine, with gold-rimmed spectacles and attentive grey eyes that took her measure without insolence, and seemed, she thought, mildly and agreeably surprised by what they found. He had perhaps looked for a flustered spinster or a grasping one, and met instead a quiet woman who sat where she was asked to sit, drew off her gloves with deliberation, and waited for him to speak. He spoke to the purpose. The estate, he confirmed, was hers without encumbrance, the freehold was clean, the consols were lodged in the funds and yielded a sum he named, the household was established and willing, and the late Mr. Tregenna's affairs had been kept, he said with a dry, small warmth, as a man keeps a clock that he means to outlast him. There were papers to sign, and she signed them, reading each first, which he watched her do without impatience, and, she suspected, with approval. When the business was done, he folded his hands and said that he would do himself the honour of waiting upon her at Tregenna Watch within the week, to walk the bounds and answer what questions the place itself would surely raise, and she thanked him, and meant it, for she had liked him. A hired chaise carried her the last stage out of the town and into the country beyond, and it was here, in the slow climbing miles of that final afternoon, that Cornwall first laid its true hand upon her. The road dwindled and roughened and ran at last between high turf-topped hedges that shut out all the world but a ribbon of pale sky. The air came in thick with salt now, unmistakable, and threaded with a far thin crying she presently understood to be gulls. The land heaved up under the wheels in long bare swells. The trees grew fewer and more crooked, all combed inland by some wind she had not yet felt, and the granite showed everywhere through the thin green skin of the moor like bone through worn cloth. And then the hedges fell away on the seaward side all at once, and she caught her breath, not in alarm, for she was not a woman much given to it, but in plain involuntary wonder, for there before and below her lay the sea, an immense cold pewter and silver plain stretching out to a horizon so far and so level that the curve of the earth seemed to declare itself upon it, and the late sun broke through a rent in the cloud and laid a single trembling road of light across all that water from the foot of the cliffs to the very rim of the world. She looked at it a long moment, with her notebook unopened in her lap. There were things, she allowed, that one did not write down at once. The chaise turned along the cliff road, the sea now constant at her left hand far below, the surf at the rocks sending up a slow white pulse she could feel in the floor of the carriage more than hear, and at length the driver lifted his whip toward a headland that ran out ahead of them above the water. And she saw Tregenna Watch for the first time. It stood high and plain and unafraid upon the very brow of the land, a low grey range of granite house with a slate roof silvered by weather, and set a little apart from it, nearer the cliff, two taller structures that drew and held her eye. One was an octagonal tower of dressed stone, 2 stories, capped with a curious slate-roofed dome that she knew at a glance, with a small leap of the heart she did not trouble to suppress, must turn upon a track to follow the sky, and the other, joined to a gabled clock-house at the house's eastern end, was the turret clock itself, its great white and gilt dial facing out to sea, catching the low sun upon its gilding so that it seemed, across the falling ground to be a second smaller sun set into the stone. As she watched, the chaise still rocking up the last of the rise, the clock began to strike the hour. The sound came to her over the wind and the surf, deep and unhurried and very pure, 5 grave strokes rolling out across the bay and dying slowly into the cry of the gulls. And she sat quite still and counted them against her watch and found them true, and something in her, some last small held breath of the long journey, let go and settled. Whatever else this place might prove, it kept good time. The chaise drew up upon a swept gravel sweep before the south door, and the household came out to meet her with a composure that matched her own, and that she liked them for. Foremost stood a tall, straight-backed woman of middle age in plain black bombazine, her iron-grey hair drawn under a white linen cap and a great ring of keys at her waist, Mrs. Trembath, the housekeeper, who curtsied without civility and welcomed her to Tregenna Watch in a voice of low Cornish gravity, naming herself and adding, with the smallest pride, that she had kept the house 31 years and would be glad to keep it for its rightful mistress now. Beside her stood a weathered, ruddy-faced man of middling years in a brown frock coat and gaitered boots, grey side whiskers framing an honest open countenance, Mr. Glanville, the steward, who knuckled his brow and said she would find the home farm in good heart and the bounds well walked. And a little behind them, scrubbed and anxious and trying very hard to stand still, was a freckled boy of 14 in a mended brown jacket, a winding key on a cord about his neck, Jory Nankervis, she would learn, who wound and tended the turret clock, and who stared at her with frank curiosity until Mrs. Trembath's eye recalled him to his manners, and he ducked his head. Theodosia thanked them each by name as it was given to her, descended from the chaise without assistance, though she allowed Mr. Glanville to hand her the last step, and stood a moment on the gravel with the wind off the sea pulling at her bonnet strings and the great clock dial gilded above her, and said, simply, that she was glad to have come, and that she hoped they would all suit one another very well. It was not much of a speech, but it was true, and they seemed to take it as such, and Mrs. Trembath, leading her in, allowed herself to observe that the old master had said his heir would be a sensible body, and that she was pleased to find him in the right of it as in most things. They gave her tea in the south library, a long low room with a sash window that framed the whole grey sweep of the sea, a coal grate burning small and bright against the evening chill, and walls of books to the ceiling, and over the next 3 weeks that room became the heart of her new life, as the observatory tower became its soul. She drank her tea slowly, warming her chilled hands upon the cup, and looked about her at the spines of the books and the worn leather of the great chair drawn close to the window, her great-uncle's chair, she did not doubt, set just there so that a man might sit through a long evening with a book in his lap and the whole sky and sea before him. And she felt, sitting in the dead man's room among the dead man's things, none of the strangeness she had braced herself to feel, but rather a curious and growing sense of having been expected. Mrs. Trembath, coming and going with the tray, fell presently into talk, as housekeepers will with a mistress they have decided to approve, and Theodosia learned in that first quiet hour 100 small true things about the place, that the master had risen by the stars and slept by the clock, and was kind to those who served him, and short only with those who wasted his light. That the curate down at St. Senara, a Mr. Penhaligon, had been the one soul thereabouts the old gentleman would willingly sit up the night with, the two of them at the telescope and the almanac till the dawn put out the stars, and that the housekeeper's own niece, a good, steady girl named Tamsin Carew, came up daily from the village to help about the house and read a fair hand and might. if the new mistress wished it, be made of more particular use. Theodosia, who had spent 8 years in the lonely sovereignty of a schoolroom, marked the offer and said she would be glad to know the girl. She did not hurry to take possession of any of it. She took possession of the place entire, gravely and by degrees, as one learns a long composition by playing it slowly through. With Mr. Raisbury, when he came as promised, she walked the bounds and made her inventory and set it down in her notebook in the columns she liked. The freehold ran to 140 acres of moor, cliff and inland farm. The consols in the funds would yield, clear, above £400 in the year, enough and more to keep all in repair and the household in comfort. The library held upward of 900 volumes, a great many of them on astronomy, navigation, and the mathematics of clocks, and the turret clock. Mr. Raisbury told her lowering his spectacles was reckoned by those who knew such things to be alone worth a sum that made her look up her great-uncle's masterwork, his name and the year of its making cut into the bell, known to ship masters down the whole length of that coast as the truest hour west of Plymouth. She wrote it all down, and the writing of it made the strange fortune real to her in a way the long journey had not. With Mr. Glanville, on another morning she walked the home farm and the inland closes, the steward pacing beside her over the springy moor with his gaitered stride, naming the fields by their old names and the few good beasts in them, and showing her where the wall wanted mending and where the spring rose sweet, and answering her questions, for she asked many, and to the purpose, with a plain, steady honesty that she valued above flattery. She found in him, without having sought it, something she had been long without and had not known she missed. The unhurried regard of an older man who knew his business and meant to do right by her, and who, when she stooped to examine the working of a field gate's iron latch and remarked that it hung half an inch low and would wear its hasp through within the 12-month, looked at her sidelong with a slow surprised respect and observed that the old master had had just that same eye for a thing out of true, and that it seemed to run in the blood. The remark stayed with her oddly through the rest of the walk, for she had been taught all her life that the blood ran the other way, that her great-uncle had been at best a half-real figure, and at worst a cautionary one. And here was his own steward telling her, as plainly as if it were a fact of husbandry, that she was like him. But it was the observatory that drew her, and on her third evening, the chores of arrival behind her and the household gone quiet, she took a lamp and the great brass key, not the winding key from her case, but the long iron key Mrs. Trembath surrendered to her with peculiar ceremony and let herself alone into the octagonal tower. The lamplight woke the brass of the great refracting telescope where it stood upon its mahogany equatorial mount beneath the slit of the dome, and showed her the meridian slit in the north wall, and the long case regulator clock standing against the stone with its slow, heavy pendulum swinging behind glass, the clock by which her great-uncle had timed the passage of every star across his wire for 40 years. She stood among it all a long while, in a stillness close to reverence, her breath smoking faintly in the cold, and then, because she could not help herself, because it was the nearest thing she had to a prayer, she took out her watch and her notebook and set herself to learn the place by the only catechism she knew. She found the dust upon the eyepiece, and did not yet disturb it. She found the great worm-wheel that turned the dome and tried it gently, and found it sweet. And she came at last to the regulator against the north wall, and stood before its slow grave face, and watched its seconds beat, and compared them against her own watch, which she had set true by a transit a fortnight gone, and trusted as she trusted few things. She watched a full minute, and then a second minute, her lips moving, and frowned a small, precise frown, and watched a third. The regulator ran fast. Not grossly. No movement of her great-uncle's making could ever have run grossly. But it gained, by her careful reckoning across the 3 minutes, very nearly 4 seconds, and a regulator that gains is a regulator subtly out of true, and a transit timed against it would be wrong by just that much, and that would never do. She did not hesitate, and she did not summon anyone. She drew a stool to the case, opened the lower door with the small key that hung inside, and considered the pendulum and its rating nut beneath the bob with the unflustered attention of a woman entirely in her element. To go fast was to be too short. The bob must come down. The pendulum lengthened. The beat slowed by the smallest perceptible turn. She breathed on her cold fingers, and with the lightest possible touch, she turned the rating nut a bare quarter turn to lower the bob, then steadied the great pendulum to its swing again, and stood back and waited, watch in hand, in a patience she found wholly pleasant, while the long room ticked, and the sea sounded faintly through the stone, and the lamp threw her shadow up among the instruments. Of a dead man she had never met, and was coming, oddly, to love. She gave it 10 full minutes by her watch, and then compared the seconds again, and the gain was halved, and she turned the nut a breath more, the very ghost of a movement, and waited again, and at the end of it the regulator beat with her watch second for second, true and patient and exact, as it had been made to do. She wrote the correction in her notebook, the date, the hour, the amount, the turns of the nut, beneath the inventory of her inheritance, and she found that this single small entry gave her a satisfaction deeper than all the acres in the consols together, for it was the first true work she had done in this place, and it was the kind of work for which the place existed. And for which, she was beginning to understand, she herself had been chosen. She closed the case and put out the lamp at the last, and stood a moment in the dark with the moon now risen and pouring its cold light down through the open slit upon the floor, and she thought that she would do very well here, and that the stars and the clocks were safe with her, and that this, perhaps, was all that anyone could ask of a life. So the first weeks passed in such quiet industry, each day adding its small true entry to her notebook and her contentment, until upon a grey still morning near the end of the 3rd week the order of it was disturbed. Mrs. Trembath came to her in the South Library, with her composed face composed a little too carefully, and presented upon a small salver a gentleman's calling card that had been left, she said, not an hour since, at the south door by a manservant who had not stayed. Theodosia took it up and turned it to the light. It was an over-large card, a little soiled at one corner, printed in a flourishing and over-confident hand, and it bore the name of Sir Goderic Trevenna. Beneath the engraved name, in a wet looping ink, a few words had been added, that the writer, having but lately learned of his connection's decease and of the disposition of the estate, looked to call upon the present occupant within the week upon a matter touching the late will, and trusted he would be received. Theodosia read it through twice, slowly, and then set it down upon the salver again with a perfectly steady hand, and looked for a moment out at the cold sea through the long window while the turret clock began, beyond the wall, to strike the hour true and grave across the bay. He came on the 3rd morning after his card, and he came in a hired chaise far too grand for the lanes of Porthandrea, the postboys sweating, the springs groaning at the gravel sweep, and Mrs. Trembath, who had been 31 years at Tregenna Watch and had seen a great many men come up that drive with their hats in their hands, stood at the south door with her ring of keys in both hands, and announced him in a voice that gave nothing away. Theodosia was in the South Library when the wheels turned on the gravel. She had been at the writing table since first light, with the great-uncle's observation register open before her and her own brass cornered notebook beside it, comparing a column of figures in a hand she had never known against a column of figures in her own, and she did not rise in a hurry. She closed the register without haste, laid a clean sheet of blotting paper over the open page so that the ink should not be smudged nor the figures seen, set her silver pocket watch face up on the cloth where she could read it, and only then went to the window. Below her on the sweep stood Sir Goderic Trevenna, easing himself down from the chaise like a man lowering a sack of meal, his too tight primrose yellow waistcoat straining at its buttons under a bottle green tailcoat, a quizzing glass on a black ribbon swinging at his throat, and behind him a second, leaner gentleman in a black bagwig and gown with a worn leather bag clutched to his chest, and the look of a man who would rather have been almost anywhere else. That, she thought, would be the barrister. She had been expecting the barrister. She rang for Mrs. Trembath, asked that the gentleman be shown into the library and that a tray be sent in, asked further that a note be carried at once down to the curate at St. Senara, and another to the inn at Porthandrea, where Mr. Raisbury of Truro had taken a room 2 days since at her own quiet request, for she was not a woman who waited upon events when she might, instead, arrange to meet them. And then she sat down again at the writing table, drew the blotting paper a little straighter, and folded her cream-gloved hands upon it to wait. Sir Goderic came in talking. He came in as such men always come in, filling the doorway with apology and the room with himself, all my dear cousin, and what a melancholy occasion, and how he had hastened the very moment he heard. Lowering himself uninvited into the best chair by the sea-view sash, and lifting his quizzing glass to peer about the library at the long shelves of bound observations, the brass instruments on the side table, the worn good furniture, letting the glass fall again on its ribbon with a little practised sigh, as though appraising what he had already decided was his. His barrister, Mr. Pringle, did not sit at once. He stood by the door with his bag against his chest and his sallow face unhappy, and he bowed to her with more correctness than his client had shown, and she marked that too, and was glad of it, for a reluctant adversary is half a friend. She let Sir Goderic talk. She had learned. In 11 years of keeping order over a schoolroom of 40 children, that a great deal might be discovered by simply letting a person say everything he had come to say, and so she sat, with her grey blue eyes set wide and direct upon him, and let him come, by his own circling road, to his purpose. He grieved, he said, that the dear old gentleman should have died so solitary. With no proper family about him, he had always meant to come down and sit with him, only the distance, only his own affairs, and it was the more grievous, was it not, that in his last solitary years the poor old man's mind had perhaps not been entirely what once it was, for there were those who had seen him wandering the cliff at all hours with his instruments, talking to the moon. An old man quite alone, and who could say what such a man might sign, or to whom, or under what persuasion? Here the quizzing glass came up again, and he looked at her through it, and his wet half-smile widened, and he said that he had not come to make trouble between kin, the saints forbid, but that a paper had come into his hands which he was in honour bound to bring forward. A later paper than the one she had been shown, and he nodded to Mr. Pringle, who with visible distaste opened his leather bag and drew out a folded document tied with a faded ribbon and laid it on the writing table before her, and Sir Goderic sat back and folded his fawn-gloved hands over his straining waistcoat and waited, for the first time, in silence. She did not snatch at it. She drew it toward her by one corner, untied the ribbon and unfolded it upon the cloth, and she read it through twice, slowly, from the salutation to the seal, while the sea moved beyond the sash and the turret clock in its gabled house struck the half-hour over the bay, one clear stroke carried in on the wind. It was, she had to allow, a handsome forgery. It purported to be a codicil to the last will and testament of Mr. Jago Tregenna, clockmaker, of Tregenna Watch, in the parish of St. Senara by the Cliff, revoking and setting aside all former dispositions of the Cliff estate, and bequeathing the same observatory, turret clock, workshop, freehold, and the consoles for their maintenance, instead and entirely to his beloved kinsman Sir Goderic Trevenna, Baronet, and it was subscribed in a cramped old hand that did indeed resemble, to a careless eye, the great uncle's own, and it was witnessed by two names she did not know, and it was dated. It was dated, she saw, with the particular and fatal vanity of a forger who has gilded his own lily, on a night in the late autumn of the year before last, and beneath the date the clerk who had drawn it had added, no doubt thinking it a fine corroborating flourish, the words that the testator, being abroad upon the cliff that night at his observations of the total eclipse of the moon, and being of sound mind and clear sight under that token of providence, did set his hand. Theodosia read those words a third time, and something in her went very still and very quiet, the particular stillness of a person who has been handed by an enemy precisely the rope with which he means to be hanged, and she let none of it reach her face. She refolded the document along its own creases and set it down upon the cloth between them, and laid her gloved hand flat beside it. Not upon it, and she said, in the even, unhurried voice she used to settle a restless schoolroom, that it was a serious paper and deserved serious examination, and that as she was but newly come into the property and had taken legal advice in the ordinary way, she hoped Sir Goderic would not object if those advising her were present before anything further was said. He could hardly object. He spread his hands and protested that he wished nothing better than that everything should be open and above board among kin, though the quizzing glass came up once more and his small pale eyes went, just once, to the folded paper on the cloth as if to be sure of it, and at that moment, as if the house itself kept good time, there were wheels again upon the gravel, and Mrs. Trembath at the door, and Mr. Raisbury of Truro was shown in, 61 years old and unhurried, in plain black superfine, with his gold-rimmed spectacles and his attentive grey eyes, and on his heels, breathless from the cliff path, with his cassock skirt still flying, came the curate, Mr. Penhaligon of St. Senara, his ink-stained fingers clutching two fat brown leather volumes to his chest. The temper of the room changed with their coming, and Sir Goderic felt it change, and did not like it. Miss Raisbury took the chair Theodosia indicated, drew on his own spectacles, and asked, with the mildness of a man requesting the time of day, whether he might see the paper of which his client had written him. And he read it, as she had read it. Twice, slowly, and when he came to the date, and the flourish beneath the date, his grey eyes lifted once to Theodosia's across the table, and the smallest understanding passed between them, lawyer to client, and was gone. He set the codicil down. He said, mildly, that it was a grave document, and raised grave questions, and that the proper course was surely to test it against the known facts before the court was troubled, since a paper either agreed with the facts of the world, or it did not. Sir Goderic said heartily that he asked nothing fairer. He was sure of his paper. Let it be tested as much as they pleased. And so Theodosia rose, and crossed to the side table, and brought back the great-uncle's observation register, the one she had been reading at dawn, and laid it on the cloth, and opened it not at random, but to the very leaf she had marked, the leaf for that autumn, and turned it so that all might see. The great-uncle, she said quietly, had kept these books for 40 years, a line for every clear night, the state of the sky, the instruments used, the objects observed, the rate of the regulator clock that timed his transits to the half-second, and here was the autumn of the year named in the Codicil, here was the very week, here were the nights on either side, each with its modest entry in his cramped clear hand, a transit of a double star, one night, the planet Saturn and its ring another, cloud and no observing a third, and here, she said, and laid one gloved finger on the line, was the night itself, the night on which this paper says he stood upon the cliff and watched the moon swallowed in eclipse and signed away his life's work by that light. And the entry for that night, in the great uncle's own unmistakable hand, read in its entirety, hazy, moon near the full and very bright, no observing of consequence, regulator gaining 1 second, retired early. Near the full, she repeated, into the silence, not eclipsed, near the full and very bright. Sir Godric's wet smile had grown fixed. He said, with a wave of the quizzing glass, that an old man's private scribbling was a poor frail thing to set against a witnessed legal instrument, that the dear old fellow's memory wandered, as he had said, that a man may write hazy in his book, and yet have seen what he saw. And it was here that Theodosia did the thing she had risen at dawn to be ready to do, the thing for which she had sent down the cliff for the curate and his fat brown volumes, and she did it without raising her voice, for she had no need to raise it. A man's private book, she allowed, might wander, but the heavens do not wander, and the eclipses of the moon are not a matter of one old man's memory, nor of any man's, but are reckoned and printed years beforehand by the Astronomer Royal and published for the use of every navigator in His Majesty's fleet, the same to Truro as to Greenwich, the same to a baronet as to a schoolmistress. And whether the moon was eclipsed on a given night of a given year is not a thing to be argued, but a thing to be looked up. And she nodded to Mr. Penhaligon, who had been waiting with his volumes hugged to his cassock like a man holding the answer to a prayer, and he came forward and set them on the table. The Nautical Almanac and Astronomical Ephemeris, the parish's own copies. For the years in question, the very books from which generations of Cornish masters had taken their reckonings before standing out past the headland, and he opened the proper volume to the proper month with his ink-stained fingers and turned it so that all might read, and there, printed plain in the column of phenomena for that autumn, set down by the Astronomer Royal himself 2 full years before ever the moon rose on the night the Codicil named, was the simple printed fact that there had been one eclipse of the moon in the whole of that year, and it had fallen in the spring, partial only, and low, and that, in the autumn, in the very week, on the very night, written into Sir Godric's handsome paper, there had been no eclipse of the moon at all, not total, not partial, not anywhere over England or the wide sea, the moon that night being but 1 day from the full, and riding high and round and brilliant over a clear enough Cornish coast, exactly as the great-uncle's own little entry had said. There was a silence in the South Library then, and it was not Theodosia's silence. For she had said her say, it was Sir Godric's silence. The silence of a man who has watched the floor open beneath the chair he had thought his own. Miss Penhaligon, who was a gentle man and had not the stomach for triumph, added only, in his mild scholar's way, that the parish register and his own predecessor's diary both bore the matter out, the autumn of that year having been remembered along the coast not for any eclipse but for a fair clear spell and a great run of pilchards, and that the turret clock's own maintained rate, logged week by the late Mr. Tregenna, and never once mentioning so notable a thing as an eclipse night observation, told the same tale, but he need scarcely have spoken, for it was Mr. Pringle, the barrister, who ended it. Mr. Pringle had drawn the printed almanac slowly toward himself across the cloth, and had read the column through twice. his lean, sallow face going by degrees the colour of his bagwig, and now he set it down very carefully, as a man sets down a thing he wishes he had never touched, and he rose, and he gathered his gown about him, and he said, to the room rather than to his client, in the flat, exhausted voice of a professional man who has just seen his own ruin in another's, that a codicil could not be witnessed beneath the light of an eclipse on a night the Astronomer Royal had printed 2 years in advance would have no eclipse, that no instrument so dated could survive the lifting of one finger in any court in the kingdom, and that he could not and would not carry such a paper before a judge, and begged leave to withdraw from the matter entirely. He bowed to Theodosia, a deeper bow than he had given on coming in, and he bowed to Mr. Raisbury, lawyer to lawyer, and he did not bow to Sir Goderic at all, but took up his worn leather bag and walked out of the South Library and was heard to call for his hat in the hall. Sir Goderic was left in the best chair by the sea-view sash, with his quizzing glass dangling forgotten on its ribbon, and his primrose waistcoat heaving. And for a long moment he did the only thing left to such a man, which was to bluster, that this was a conspiracy of a country attorney and a parson and a scheming spinster, that the books might be wrong, the printers careless, the old man's hand forged the other way, that he would have his rights if it cost him every penny, but he said it to a room that had already turned its face from him. And he heard it, and his voice ran down like a clock with a broken spring. It was Mr. Raisbury who closed the matter, and he did it without heat, taking off his gold-rimmed spectacles and polishing them upon a square of linen as he spoke, observing in the dry level tones of his trade that the law was very tender these days of those who uttered false instruments for gain, that a forged testamentary paper was no light thing but a felony, that he, Raisbury, had now seen the document, and the date upon it, and the printed almanac that gave it the lie, and that he was professionally bound to remember all three, and that it would be, he thought, a very great kindness to Sir Goderic himself were the whole unhappy paper to be quietly given up and withdrawn this very hour, and never spoken of again, before any officer of any court was troubled to take notice of how it came to be drawn, or by whom, or who had stood as its imaginary witnesses under an eclipse that the heavens themselves declined to provide. He let that sit. He replaced his spectacles. And Sir Goderic Trevenna, florid and sweating in the good chair that was not his, and never had been, understood at last that he had not been refused but cornered, that the schoolmistress across the table had not wept or pleaded or even raised her voice, but had simply, quietly, with a child's ruled notebook and a clergyman's borrowed almanac, taken the very flourish of which he had been proudest, and turned it into the noose mister. Raisbury had just so gently shown him, and he reached out one fawn-gloved hand and took up the folded codicil from the cloth where it lay between them, and after a moment in which the only sound was the sea and the gulls and the far steady tick of the regulator clock against the north wall, he tied its faded ribbon about it again, with fingers that were not quite steady. And he gave it not to Theodosia, but to Mr. Raisbury, who received it without a word, and laid it inside his own black bag, and drew the strap. Theodosia rose then, and she was courtesy itself, for she had won and had no need to be anything else. She said that she was sure her cousin would wish to be on the Truro road before the light failed in the lanes, and that Mrs. Trembath would see his chaise brought round, and she did not offer him the tray that had been sent in and stood untouched, and she did not give him her hand. He went heavily, the quizzing glass swinging dead on its ribbon, his bottle green back filling the library door as it had filled it coming in, and at the threshold he paused as if to muster one last word. and looked back at her standing slim and upright by the writing table with the great-uncle's open register and the printed almanac, and her own small notebook all spread upon the cloth before her, and the cold, clear sea-light falling on her dove-grey gown. And whatever the word had been, he did not say it, and went out, and a minute later the wheels turned on the gravel sweep and dwindled down the lane toward Porthandrea and were gone under the cry of the gulls. For a little while no one in the South Library spoke. Mr. Penhaligon let out a long breath and confessed, with a mild rueful smile, that he had not known, when he carried those heavy volumes up the cliff, that he was carrying the whole weight of the case in his arms. And Mr. Raisbury allowed, polishing his spectacles once more, that in 41 years of probate he had never seen a forgery undone so cleanly, nor by so unanswerable a witness as the printed heavens, and that he should dine out on the tale, with names suppressed, for the remainder of his career. But Theodosia did not smile yet. She crossed instead to the open register and stood looking down at the great-uncle's small, cramped, honest line, hazy, moon near the full and very bright, no observing of consequence, regulator gaining 1 second, retired early, written by a solitary old man on an ordinary night when he had no notion that the truthful nothing he set down would, 2 autumns later, reach out of his closed book to defend a great niece he had never met against a thief, and she laid one cream-gloved finger very gently upon the line, as one might touch a hand, and she said, half to herself and half to the 2 good men who had stood with her, that the stars had kept better records than the forger had reckoned on, and that her great-uncle had been believed at last, and on the strength of his own plain word. The carriage that bore Sir Goderic Trevena and his uneasy barrister away down the cliff road left behind it a silence that was not the silence of triumph, but the older, steadier silence of a house returning to its proper rhythm, and Theodosia stood a long moment at the south door, with the broken sealed forgery still folded in her hand, before she gave it over to Mr. Raisbury to be docketed and kept, not as a trophy, but as evidence that the law might want once more and never would, and then she walked out across the gravel sweep to the edge of the walled garden, where the wind off the sea came clean and cold and smelt of salt and gorse, and she let it take the last of the matter out of her, because a thing proven need not be carried. And a woman who keeps records knows the difference between what must be remembered and what may at last be set down. In the weeks that followed, she did not so much take possession of Tregenna Watch as fall into step with it, learning its hours the way she had always learned the hours of any clock put into her keeping, by listening, by watching, by setting her own habits beside its rate until the 2 ran true together. The turret clock struck the quarters over the bay, and she came to know each one by its place in the day, the 8 strokes of the morning that brought Mrs. Trembath through the house with her ring of keys, the noon that she liked to check against her own pocket watch and against the meridian transit when the sun would show, the dusk strokes that called the gulls in off the headland in a long grey turning ribbon, and she found that the village below, Porthandrea with its slate roofs stepped down to the harbour, set its own day by that strike as her great-uncle had meant it to, the fishermen reading the dial from the water, and the women in the cottages counting the bells. It pleased her in a quiet and undramatic way that she would not have called by any larger name to be the keeper of a thing the whole bay leaned upon, and she resolved early that she would keep it well, not as a relic of a dead man, but as a working instrument, wound and rated and honest. Because a clock that is allowed to drift becomes a lie told to everyone who trusts it, and she had had enough of forgeries to last her a life. So she began with the boy. Jory Nankervis was 14, freckled and open-faced. his brown jacket mended at both elbows and a winding key worn on a cord about his neck, as another boy might wear a whistle, and he had tended the turret clock since his 12th year for a few shillings a quarter. Which is to say, he had wound it faithfully and oiled it badly and understood nothing of why it ran as it did, only that it must not stop. Theodosia took him up the narrow stair of the clock house on a still grey morning, and instead of telling him at once what he did wrong, she asked him to show her what he did, and she watched him heave on the winding handle, and watched the great stone weights rise in their shaft, and watched him stand back, satisfied, his task complete, and she saw the whole untaught earnestness of him, and warmed to it. Then she taught him. She showed him the going train and the striking train, and made him put his hand flat against the frame to feel the beat, the steady tick-tock that was not two sounds, but one sound divided, and she taught him to listen for the limp in it, the unevenness that means the movement is out of beat, leaning, robbing one swing of the pendulum to feed the next, and she set the crutch true so the boy could hear the difference, the lame stride become an even one, and she watched his face change as he heard it, the way a face changes when a thing that was only a job becomes a thing understood. She taught him that oil is a poison given in spoonfuls, that the pallets want a touch, and the pivots want a touch, and the great wheel wants almost nothing, and that the boy who drowns a movement in oil to be kind to it is the boy who gums it solid in a 12-month and stops the whole bay's day. She gave him a little ruled book of his own, plain paper sewn between marbled boards, and she wrote on the first page, in her clear upright hand, the date and the clock's rate as she found it that week, losing some few seconds in the day, a slow and forgivable fault she would teach him to take up by the regulating nut, and she told him that from this day he was not to wind the clock and walk away, but to wind it and stand still and listen and write down what he heard, the rate, the strike, the weather, the wind, because a clock keeps a kind of diary if a person will only take it down, and a person who takes it down for 40 years leaves behind something no forger can ever counterfeit. The boy did not fully understand her, not yet, but he understood that he had been given something. And he carried the book home inside his jacket as if it might blow away, and he came back the next morning with the first day's entry already made in a round, laborious hand, and Theodosia, reading it, felt a satisfaction deeper and quieter than any she had felt facing down Sir Goderic across the library table, because the defeat of a liar lasts a season, but the making of a keeper lasts a generation. She did not stop at the boy. The parish of St. Senara by the cliff had its reading class of a Sunday afternoon in the cold nave under the squat tower, a dozen children and a few grown labourers who had never had their letters, taught indifferently by whoever the curate could press into it, and Mr. Penhaligon, the curate, with his mild dark eyes and his ink-stained fingers and his plain black cassock, had mentioned the class to her almost apologetically, not asking, only telling, the way a man tells of a thing he has long meant to do better. She had been a schoolmistress 8 years and more in the parish she came from, and a schoolmistress does not leave the calling at a county boundary. It is in the hand and the voice and the patience of her, and within a fortnight she had taken the reading class as her own, not displacing the curate but standing beside him, and she taught the way she taught everything, by listening first and correcting gently, and never letting a child feel small for not yet knowing, and the cold nave warmed with the low murmur of voices sounding out there, letters, and the labourers who had been ashamed to come came, because the new mistress of Tregenna Watch up on the cliff sat among them on the same plain bench, and made no man feel he was being condescended to. She brought them, in time, a thing none of them had thought to want. She brought them the sky. On a clear, cold night near the quarter moon, she had the older children and 2 or 3 of the men up the cliff path to the observatory, and she let them, one by one, put an eye to the great brass refractor on its mahogany mount, and look at the moon's edge where the mountains stood up sharp along the line of light and dark. And she heard the indrawn breath of a grown fisherman who had read the moon off the water his whole life and never once seen its broken rim brought close, and she understood, watching him, something of why her great-uncle had built his whole life upon this headland and given the bay its clock, because a man who has been shown the moon's mountains carries them, and walks a little differently under the night ever after. The home farm she walked with Mr. Glanville, the steward, his weathered, ruddy face and grey side whiskers, and his honest, plain speech, a comfort to her. And he showed her the modest acreage inland, the few fields and the home pasture and the walled kitchen garden set back safe from the cliff edge. And he told her without flattery what the land could and could not do, where the wind scoured the barley, and where the hollow held the frost, and where, in a kind year, the early potatoes came on a fortnight before the village below could lift theirs, and she listened, and asked, and wrote, because a holding is a kind of clock too, with its own rate and its own drift, and a keeper learns it by listening. Glanville had served her great-uncle 30 years, and he spoke of the old man not as the family had taught Theodosia to speak of him, as a fable, a recluse, a name half-believed, but as a real and particular person, exact and kind and given to long silences, a man who would stand at the cliff edge for an hour watching the weather come up the channel and then go in and write 3 lines and be content. And the more Glanville spoke, the more Theodosia felt the great-uncle take on weight and shape behind her, the fable settling into a man, until she found she wanted very much to know him, which is a strange wanting to feel for the dead, and a tender one. She took, in those weeks, a companion to herself almost without deciding to. Miss Tamsin Carew was the housekeeper's niece, 24, with soft mid-brown hair under a small lace cap and a quick warm smile, and a habit of being useful before she was asked, and she came up from the village at first to help her aunt, and stayed because Theodosia found her company easy and her reading voice clear. And the South Library, with its sea-view sash and its coal grate burning against the cliff damp, became in the long evenings a room of 2 women, one at the writing table with her logs and her almanacs, and one in the window seat reading aloud. And the arrangement formalized itself into a place, and a small salary, without either of them quite naming the moment it happened. Theodosia began to teach Tamsin too, because she could not help it, and within a month the girl could be trusted to take the observation register on a night when her mistress was wanted elsewhere, to set down the hour and the seeing and the cloud and the instrument used, in a hand growing daily steadier, and Theodosia, who had come to Cornwall a single woman with no soul to teach, but a schoolroom. Left behind, found that the headland had quietly given her 3 pupils, the boy at the clock, the children in the nave, and the girl at her elbow, and that the loneliness she had not let herself name on the long coach road west had been answered without her ever asking it aloud. It was Tamsin who was with her on the afternoon of the second discovery, and so it was a thing shared, which Theodosia was afterward glad of. She had gone into the horological workshop to take a proper inventory at last, a thing she had put off through the weeks of the claimant and the settling, and the workshop was a long, low room of benches and half-finished movements, and a wall hung with pendulum bobs and graduated weights in their racks, the smell of brass and oil and old wood in it. And in the corner stood a heavy iron strongbox she had taken for the place where her great-uncle kept his tools of greatest worth, the master gauges and the depthing tools and the like. She had the key for it on the ring Mrs. Trembath had given her, a key she had never had cause to turn, and she turned it now, expecting tools, and found instead the work of a life. The strongbox held, stacked and ordered and wrapped each one in oiled paper against the damp, the great-uncle's private observation logbooks, and there were more of them than she could count at a glance. She counted them after, and there were 43 volumes, 1 to a year and some years more, each bound in plain board and labelled on the spine in a hand she did not yet know, but would come to know better than her own, and she lifted the topmost out and opened it, and the date at the head of the first page made her sit slowly down upon the workshop stool, because it carried her back 40 years and more to before she was born, and the page was a night's observing set down in a small exact hand, the hour and the instrument and the object and the seeing. The very form she herself had kept these dozen years in her own ruled book, the form she had thought a habit private to herself and faintly eccentric, and here it was looking back at her out of 40 years, the same discipline, the same patience, the same love spelled out in numbers, as if she had been keeping all her solitary life a correspondence with a man she had never met. She turned the pages, and the years turned with them, and she saw the bay's whole weather written down, the great storms named by their dates, the comets he had caught and timed, the transits of the inner planets across the sun's face logged to the second against the regulator clock she now wound herself, the eclipses, every true eclipse of 40 years, each one observed and drawn and dated. And not one of them, she saw at a glance, that turned to a slow cold certainty, falling on the night the forged codicil had claimed, so that the logbooks themselves, had she ever needed them, would have damned Sir Goderic over again and 40 times over. The dead man's own steady hand reaching out of the strongbox to confirm what she had already proven by the almanac. But it was not the eclipses that stopped her breath. Folded into the front board of the very first volume, sealed with a wafer and addressed in that same small hand to no name at all, but only to the words, "To whoever shall keep the watch after me." If she be the right one, there was a letter, and Theodosia held it a long moment before she broke the wafer, and Tamsin, who had come to her shoulder and seen it, said nothing at all, only stood near, and the coal shifted in the workshop grate, and the turret clock struck the half-hour over the bay, and under the falling strokes Theodosia opened the letter her great-uncle had left for her, without ever knowing her face. The hand was the hand of the logbooks, the same small exact letters, but slower here, and given to longer lines, as a man writes who is setting down at last a thing he has carried unsaid a long while, and it began without flourish, as he had begun every page of his life, with a kind of plain courtesy to the unknown reader. He wrote that he supposed whoever read these words would be a stranger to him in the flesh, for he had outlived the few who knew him, and chosen long ago the company of the stars and the clocks above the company of men, and that he would not pretend to a grief he did not feel at the parting, having had, on the whole, the life he wished, on the headland he loved, doing the work he was made for, but that there was one thing he had wished for and not had. And that was a hand to give it all to that would keep it as he had kept it, not sell the telescope for the brass of it, nor let the great clock run down for want of understanding. And he confessed that for many years he had despaired of finding such a hand, the family being what the family was, scattered and indifferent and given, some of them, to debt. And he had near resigned himself to leaving the watch to the parish and trusting to luck. Then he wrote, and here Theodosia felt the room go very still about her. Then he had read, some 4 years gone, in a county paper come up from the east by the carrier, a small notice of no importance to anyone but himself, a letter to the editor from a country schoolmistress, signed with a woman's name. correcting an error in the printed lunar tables that the paper had reproduced from the almanac, an error of some seconds in the time of the moon's southing, which the writer had caught not by cleverness, but, she said plainly, by having watched the moon cross her own meridian on the night in question and timed it against her schoolroom clock and found the book wrong. He had read it 3 times, he wrote. He had sat with the paper in his lap a long while, for he knew, none better, how rare a thing it was, not the knowledge, which might be learnt, but the temper of mind behind it, the woman who, finding the printed authority and her own patient observation at odds, did not doubt herself and defer to the book, nor doubt the book and keep her peace, but trusted what she had seen with her own eyes and her own clock, and said so, quietly, in public, with the figures to prove it. For that, he wrote, was the whole of the thing. That was the temper that kept a watch honest, and would keep this one honest after him. And he had made inquiries, discreetly, through Mr. Raisbury and others, and learnt her name and her circumstances, and that she was his own kin, however distant, a great niece he had never met. And he had thought to himself that the stars had been kind to him at the last, and sent him an heir out of his own blood, who was also, and far more rarely, an heir out of his own mind. He had not written to her, he confessed, nor sent for her, nor disturbed the plain, hard life she led, partly from the long habit of his solitude, and partly from a delicacy he hoped she would forgive. For what was he to say to her, an old man on a far cliff, that would not sound either a madness or a snare? And so he had done the only thing he trusted, which was to put it all in his will, plainly and past breaking, observatory and clock and workshop and freehold and the funds to keep them, and leave the rest to her own good sense, knowing that a woman who would correct the lunar tables in the public prints would not be long in seeing to the bottom of any trouble that came to her over it. And then, near the end, the hand slowing further, he had written the lines that Theodosia would carry the rest of her life, and never read aloud to anyone, not even to the Duke in the good years that came after, the lines in which the old man set down, without self-pity and without asking anything in return, that he had been content, but that he had been lonely, that there is a particular loneliness in seeing what few others see, and having no one to turn to in the dark and say, look there, and that he hoped, if she were the right one, she would not be as lonely as he had been, that she would find the headland kinder to her than to him, that she would take a companion and teach a child, and not let the long nights at the glass close her off from the warm rooms below as they had, a little, closed him. And he ended. The strokes of the turret clock long since faded into the workshop's quiet, with the plainest blessing a clockmaker could give, that her days might run true and her nights be clear, and his name beneath it, Jago Tregenna, and the date, and nothing more. Theodosia did not weep over it, for she was not a woman given to weeping, and the great-uncle himself had not asked for tears, having declined to shed any of his own. But she sat a long while on the workshop stool, with the letter open on her knee, and the 43 volumes ranked beside her, and she felt the whole of her life rearrange itself quietly behind her, the way a row of figures rearranges when one corrects an error at the head of the column, and every sum below it comes suddenly true. All her solitary years bent over the schoolroom clock, all the nights she had stood alone at a cottage window with a borrowed glass, and a numbed hand timing a transit that no soul in the parish cared a straw for. All the gentle mockery she had borne, and the gentler pity, the schoolmistress with her queer little book of moon phases. The woman who would never marry because she would sooner watch Saturn than dance, all of it she had taken for an oddity in herself, a harmless eccentricity that set her a little apart and would die with her unremarked. And here was a man 40 years dead in his discipline before her, and 4 years dead in his body, who had read one small notice in a country paper and seen in it not an oddity, but a kinship, and had reached across the whole length of his careful life to hand her his own, saying in effect, "You are not strange, you are mine, you are what I was. Take it and keep it, and do not be as lonely as I was." She understood, sitting there, that she had not merely inherited an estate. She had been recognized, and she found that being recognized truly and exactly by one who knew the worth of the thing he recognized was a gift past the value of the freehold and the consols and the famous clock together, and that the family who had taught her to think Jago Tregenna a fable had been the poorer party in that bargain all along, having let go, for the trouble of believing in an unfashionable relation. The one man among them who had ever truly seen what any of them were. She told Tamsin, after a while, a little of what the letter held, not the lonely lines, those she kept, but the matter of the lunar tables and the county paper. And Tamsin, 24 and warm-hearted, did weep a little where her mistress had not. And Theodosia let her, and was glad of the borrowed tears, and the two of them carried the topmost 3 volumes down to the South Library that evening and set them on the table by the lamp, and the reframing of the family's history began there, gently and without any drama at all, in the reading of an old man's nights. For Theodosia took to reading the logbooks of an evening as another woman might read letters from a beloved correspondent, a volume to a fortnight, in order, from the first year forward, and the great uncle who had been a name and then a fable became now. Through his own 40 years of nights, a companion, she came to know which planets he loved best, and which double stars he returned to year on. Year like a man visiting old friends, and she found, threaded all through the figures, the same dry, mild humour that she recognized, with a small shock, each time as her own. The family had told her, in the way families tell a child what to think, that old Jago Tregenna had gone queer and solitary out of some sourness, and the logbooks told her plainly that he had gone solitary out of love. Love of a difficult and exacting and beautiful thing that few would sit still long enough to learn, and that there had been no sourness in him at all, only a man who had found his one true work early and given it everything, and asked the world to leave him to it, which the world, busy with its debts and its marriages, had been glad enough to do. She resolved, reading him, that she would not let his nights go to waste in a strong-box. She would have Mr. Penhaligon, who had the Latin and the patience, help her copy the most valuable of the observations fair, the transits and the eclipses and the comet timings, and send them up to the County Observatory Society, so that the 40 years of an unknown clockmaker on a Cornish cliff should not be lost to the science he had served unthanked, and the curate agreed before she had finished asking. And the long copying out became a labour of the winter evenings, the 3 of them at the dead man's nights, warming a cold great uncle's memory back into a kind of company. And so the second discovery, which a lesser house might have made into a thunderclap, settled instead into the steady rhythm of the watch. The boy wound the clock and listened and wrote. The children sounded their letters in the cold nave, and the quick ones began to ask her of an evening what made the moon change its face. The curate copied the eclipses fair. Tamsin read aloud, and kept the register and learnt the stars. The home farm came on toward its spring, and Theodosia Lanyon, who had arrived at Tregenna Watch a stranger to a fable and a target for a forger, found herself by the turn of the year the centre of a small, warm circle of work and care that ran as true and as quiet as the great clock over the bay, and she would have told you, had you asked her, that she wanted nothing more of life than this, and she would have believed it when she said it. which is a thing worth noting. For it was in just such a season of a woman wanting nothing that the County Observatory Society sent down its winter notices, and among the names of those expected at the spring assembly, where Theodosia herself was asked to read again upon the timing of the moon, there was printed, in the plain type of such lists, a name she did not yet know to mark, the name of a patient widower who had once, months before in a crowded county room, heard a country schoolmistress read a paper on lunar timing and had not since quite been able to forget her. It was Mrs. Trembath who first spoke his name aloud in the house, and she spoke it the way she spoke the names of the long-established families of the 100, with a small settling of the shoulders that meant the person under discussion was a fixture rather than a novelty. The Duke of Roseworthy, she said, setting down the morning's letters upon the South Library table in their usual neat fan, had sent his card up from the lodge, and with it a note in his own hand, and she laid both upon the polished mahogany as though they were merely 2 more items in the day's ordinary accounting. Theodosia did not snatch at the card. She finished ruling the line she had begun in the observation register, the entry for the previous night. A clear, cold sky, Jupiter well placed above the headland, the 4 little moons strung out to the east of the planet like beads on an invisible thread, and she blotted it, and she capped the inkwell, and only then did she draw the card across the table to her with one gloved finger. She had seen the name before, of course. She had heard it in Cornwall already, in the village, and from Mr. Glanville, and twice from the curate, always with that same air of long acquaintance, and she had encountered the man himself, once months before any of this, in a high-panelled room in Truro that smelt of beeswax and cold tea, where the County Observatory Society held its quarterly assembly, and a schoolmistress of no fortune had been permitted, by the kindness of Mr. Penhaligon's letter of introduction, to read aloud a short paper of her own composition upon the timing of lunar occultations and the small persistent errors she had found in the printed tables. She had not, at the time, marked him particularly. She had been too occupied with her own steadiness, with keeping her voice level and her pages in order and her finger upon the correct line of figures, to take much note of the faces ranged along the benches below the reading desk. But she remembered now, drawing the card toward her, that there had been a gentleman near the back who had not whispered to his neighbour, who had not consulted his watch, who had sat with his arms folded and his head a little inclined, and had listened to the whole of her paper as though it were a thing worth the listening. And she remembered that when she had finished, and the polite small applause had run its course, this gentleman had asked her one question, and that the question had been a good one. Not a gallantry dressed as a query, not a gentleman's idle flourish, but a real question about her method of reducing the observed times to the meridian. The kind of question that could only be asked by a man who had himself stood at a telescope in the cold and waited for a star to touch the cross wire. She had answered it plainly. He had thanked her plainly. And that, she had supposed, was the end of it. The card in her hand told her it was not. The note beside it, when she unfolded it, was brief and unornamented and written in a square, upright hand, with no blots and no flourishes, and it said that the Duke of Roseworthy, finding himself at Roseworthy for the autumn and recollecting with great pleasure the paper Miss Lanyon had read at the Truro Assembly, begged leave to call upon her on Tuesday next, if it were convenient, having heard that the late Mr. Tregenna's instrument at Tregenna Watch was a fine one, and being himself, he confessed, an indifferent but persistent observer who had long wished to see Jupiter's moons through a glass better than his own. Theodosia read it twice. There was nothing in it of rescue, nothing of condolence pressed too warmly, nothing of the man who comes to a newly established heiress to take her measure as one takes the measure of a property, there was only a courteous, particular, and entirely truthful request to be shown the planets, and she found, reading it the second time, that her mouth had softened at one corner, and that she was, against her own habit of perfect composure, rather pleased. She replied that Tuesday would do very well, and she set the note in the small standing rack upon the writing table where she kept the few letters that required no immediate answer but that she did not wish to lose, and she said nothing further about it. But Mrs. Trembath, who missed very little in that house and had not missed the softening at the corner of the mouth, found occasion over the next 2 days to mention, without seeming to mention anything, several facts concerning the Duke of Roseworthy that a new mistress might find it useful to know. That he was 37 and a widower these 4 years. His Duchess having died of a low fever the second winter of their marriage and left no child, and that he had not, in all the 4 years since, paid his addresses anywhere, though heaven knew the county had laid table after table before him. That he kept Roseworthy quietly, and his late father's racing stable he had sold, and his late father's debts. There had been some. He had paid to the last farthing, which in Mrs. Trembath's grave reckoning told you more about a man than any number of his virtues. That he was reckoned, by those competent to reckon such things, to be neither cold nor warm but even, a man of one temperature in all weathers, which the housekeeper plainly considered a high recommendation, and that his mother, the Dowager Duchess, who lived at the Dower House across the park, and was herself a great frequenter of the Observatory Society, and had been heard to speak with marked approval of a certain paper read at Truro by a certain young person, was as shrewd a judge of character as any woman in 3 counties, and not to be imposed upon. All of this Theodosia received with the same composure she received everything, ruling her lines, rating her clocks, training the boy Jory to wind the great turret movement without slamming the click, and to oil the pallets sparingly. But she received it, and she did not forget it, and on the Tuesday she put on the better of her 2 grey gowns, and saw to it that the observatory was swept and the brass of the telescope rubbed bright, and she told herself that she did this because an instrument should always be shown clean, which was true, and not because of the man who was coming to see it, which was also, she allowed, somewhere in the matter. He came at the hour he had named, which she noted, and not before it, which she noted with more approval still, for she had a horologist's intolerance of people who could not keep an appointment to within the quarter hour, and a deeper regard yet for those who could. She received him in the South Library, with the sea-view sash thrown up, and the autumn light lying long across the floor, and the first thing she observed about the Duke of Roseworthy, beyond the lean, strong, jawed face, and the calm, dark grey eyes, and the dark brown hair brushed back with its touch of grey at the temples, was that he came into the room without filling it. That he was a tall man, and a broad-shouldered one, and might, had he chosen, have made the low-panelled library seem crowded, and that he did not so choose, but stood a moment inside the door, and looked about him at the books and the writing-table, and the open observation register with frank, unhurried interest before he made his bow. He apologized for nothing. He condoled briefly and sincerely upon her great-uncle, whom he had met but twice and admired, he said, as one admires a man who has done one thing thoroughly all his life and asked the world for nothing, and then, the civilities discharged, he came directly and without coyness to the matter of the planets, and asked whether the evening promised clear, and whether, if it did, he might be permitted after his call to climb the tower and look. They took tea first, in the library, the Dowager Duchess having come with him, a silver-haired lady in plum-grey silk, with a lorgnette and a pair of kind, shrewd eyes that went over Theodosia once, comprehensively and not unkindly, in the first half-minute, and seemed thereafter satisfied. and the talk over the tea was of the society and its members and of a comet that one of them had hoped for and that had not, in the event, performed. And Theodosia found that she could talk with these two as she had not been able to talk with anyone since she came into Cornwall, freely and on her own ground, about transits and occultations and the maddening small errors of the printed almanac. And that the Duke listened to her exactly as he had listened at Truro, with his head a little inclined and no impatience in him at all. And that the Dowager, far from being shocked to find a young woman with figures at her fingertips, leaned in upon her lorgnette and corrected one of her own remembered dates, and was corrected, in turn, gently by Theodosia, who happened to have the true date in the register not 10 feet away, and fetched it, and the old lady laughed aloud at being put right, and said that was very well. That was a young woman who knew her business, and the Duke said nothing but looked, for a moment, exceedingly pleased. The sky did clear. They climbed the tower stair when the light had gone, the Duke handing his mother up the worn stone treads with a patience that was plainly habitual and not performed, and in the cold, high observing room with its slate cap rolled back and the night standing open above the meridian slit, Theodosia set the great refractor upon the planet and stood back and let him look. He looked a long time, the way a man looks who has waited for the looking. He found the 4 moons without prompting and named them over softly to himself, and then he asked, and here again was the good question, the real one, whether her great-uncle's regulator was reliable enough that one might time the moon's eclipses against it, and so check the tables of their motions, those tables being, he understood, still imperfect, and Theodosia said that the regulator had run, since she corrected it of the 4 seconds it had gained, to better than a second a week, and that yes, one might, and that she had in fact begun to, and she showed him the column in the register where she had logged the disappearance of the innermost moon into the planet's shadow 3 nights since, timed to the second by the regulator and reduced to the meridian by her own hand. He read the column standing close to the lamp, and he was quiet over it, and when he looked up his calm grey eyes had in them something that was not gallantry and was not condescension and was, she thought, very near to respect, and he said only that it was beautifully done, and that her great-uncle had chosen his heiress well, and that he hoped. He said this plainly, looking at her and not at the register, that he might be permitted to come again. She said that he might. He came again, and then again, through the lengthening Cornish autumn, and the calls fell into a shape that was its own slow argument. He came always on the day he named and at the hour, and he came, not to rescue and not to dazzle, but to sit in the South Library and talk, or to climb the tower when the sky allowed, and once, on a wet Tuesday when the rain came in off the sea in grey ropes and there was no looking at anything, he asked whether he might be of any use to her in the matter of the estate's accounts, the quarter-day audit being then upon her, and instead of taking offence, which a lesser woman might, or being grateful past her own dignity, which she would not, she set the steward's books before him at the writing table and let him go through the consols and the rents and the home farm reckoning with her, the two of them bent over the same page in the grey light with a single candle lit against the gloom, and she found that he had a clear plain head for figures and no wish whatever to take the management out of her hands, only to understand it, and that when they had done and the columns balanced, he pushed the book back to her side of the table without comment, leaving the ownership of it exactly where it had been, which was the most courteous thing, she thought afterward, that anyone had done for her since the winding key first came into her hands. They walked, on the dry days, across the home park and out along the headland, with the gulls wheeling and the sea breaking white far below. The Dowager often with them and sometimes Miss Tamsin Carew, And the talk on those walks was of everything and of nothing, of the parish and the village, and the books he was reading, and the books she was, of his late father and her great-uncle, and the strange likeness between two men who had never met, each having spent a life upon a single steady thing. And the Duke of Roseworthy never once, in all those weeks, said a word to her of love, and Theodosia understood, with the part of her that read a meridian transit and rated a movement by ear, that this was not coldness and not slowness, but a man taking the true measure of a thing before he committed his weight to it, exactly as she would have done, exactly as she did, and she found that she was content to be so measured, and that she was, without ever having decided to be, measuring in her turn, and that the column was coming out, night after night, the same way. It was in the South Library that he asked her, on a clear, bright morning in the last of the autumn, with the sea-view sash thrown up, and the gulls crying, and the turret clock striking the hour across the bay, and he asked her plainly, sitting not standing, his calm grey eyes upon her face, that he had come to hold her in the deepest regard and the warmest affection, that he had not thought, after his loss, to feel such a thing again, and that he had measured it carefully because it was too dear a thing to be mistaken in, and finding it true and steady in himself, these many weeks he could no longer in honour keep it from her, that he was aware she wanted nothing from him, neither his rank, nor his fortune, nor his protection, being possessed of her own estate and her own competence and her own clear mind, and that this was the very thing that made him bold to ask, for he asked nothing of her but herself, and that if she could find it in her to think of him not as the Duke of Roseworthy, but as a man who would count it the great good fortune of his life to look at the stars beside her until the end of it, he begged her, with his whole heart, to be his wife. Theodosia did not answer at once, and he did not press her to. He sat quite still in the long autumn light, with his calm grey eyes upon her, and let the silence stand, as a man stands at the eyepiece and waits for the air to steady before he trusts what he sees, and she was grateful to him for that silence, as she had been grateful to him for the books pushed back across the table with their ownership untouched. She looked, for a moment, away from him and out through the open sash at the sea, grey-blue and bright and breaking white along the foot of the cliff, and at the gulls turning, and at the squat tower of St. Senara's away to the west, and she let herself feel the whole steady shape of what he had said and how he had said it, without flourish, without pressure, without once mistaking her for a thing to be rescued or managed or improved, and she found that the column had come out the same way it had come out night after night these many weeks, and that she had known the answer for longer than she had let herself name it. She turned back to him, and she answered him plainly, as he had asked her plainly, that she was sensible of the honour he did her, and that she would not insult either of them by affecting a hesitation she did not feel, that she had wanted nothing from any man, and had expected nothing, and had built her life with her own two hands upon her own ground, and would have gone on so, content, to the end of it, had she never met him, but that having met him, and having taken his measure these many weeks as carefully as he had taken hers, she found that she did not wish to look at the stars alone any longer, and that of all the men she had ever encountered, he was the only one beside whom her own clear mind felt neither dimmed nor displayed, but simply, for the first time, at rest, and that, yes, she said it without tremor and without coyness, her grey blue eyes wide and direct upon his, she would be his wife, and gladly, and with her whole heart, which she had thought, like him, never to give, and was glad past saying to be giving now. He took her gloved hand then, the one that ruled the register and rated the clocks, and he held it a moment in both of his and did not crush it nor kiss it extravagantly, but only bowed his head over it once, gravely, the way a man acknowledges a thing too large for speech. And when he lifted his face again, there was a brightness in the calm grey eyes that she had not seen there before, and that moved her more than any flood of words could have done. They sat a while longer in the South Library with the sea light on the floor and the turret clock measuring out the quarters above the bay, and they did not speak a great deal, having no need to, but settled instead in the few quiet sentences that the newly betrothed must settle, the plain practical shape of the thing, that she would not leave Tregenna Watch, nor be expected to. The estate and the observatory and the great clock being hers in her own right, and remaining so, and the Duke saying at once, before she had even framed the point, that he would not for the world part her from her own work or her own sky, and that Roseworthy was but a half-day distant, and the two estates could very well be held and loved together. That the great-uncle's observation register should go on, unbroken, in her own hand and Tamsin's, that the boy Jory should keep his place at the turret movement, and that they would, he said, smiling at last a real and unguarded smile, want a better regulator at Roseworthy if they were ever to time the moons from there, which she allowed, with the ghost of an answering smile of her own, was very true. When at length the Dowager Duchess was sent for and came in upon her lorgnette and saw the two of them sitting so, she did not need to be told, but went straight to Theodosia and took both her hands and kissed her once upon the cheek and said that she had hoped for this since Truro. Since the very afternoon a young person with figures at her fingertips had stood up at a reading desk and corrected the printed tables without turning a hair, and that she had told her son so more than once and been bidden hold her peace, and the Duke said, mildly, that his mother had not in fact held her peace at any point, which the old lady cheerfully owned, and the three of them laughed together in the long light, and it was, Theodosia thought, the easiest laughter she had known in a house in a great many years. There remained, before any of it could go forward, the small grave ceremonies that the parish required, and that she would not have shortened even had she been able, for she had come, in her months at Tregenna Watch, to love the slow proper order of the place, and the people in it. And so it was settled between them that the Duke should speak first to Mr. Raisbury in Truro, for the forms of the settlement and the law, the solicitor being already so deep in the business of the estate that no other hand would do, and that they should then go together, on the Sunday, to the curate Mr. Penhaligon in the small grey vestry of St. Senara by the cliff, to ask that the banns be read. And so it was settled between them, not with any flourish of triumph, but with the same quiet exactness that had governed every hour of her life at Tregenna Watch. And when the Duke of Roseworthy had gone back across the home park in the long gold of that Tuesday evening, his greatcoat over his arm and his stride unhurried, Theodosia Lanyon stood a while at the South Library sash and watched the light go off the sea, and felt no flutter of disbelief, but rather the steady settling of a thing she had weighed and found true. The banns were the first public sign of it. On the Sunday following, in the squat towered church of St. Senara by the cliff, with the spring sun coming thin and clear through the plain leaded glass, and the smell of beeswax and cold stone, and the salt that lived always in the fabric of that place, Mr. Penhaligon stood at the chancel step in his white surplice and read, in his mild and unhurried voice, that he published the banns of marriage between Crispin, Duke of Roseworthy, of the parish of Roseworthy, and Theodosia Lanyon, spinster, of this parish, and that if any of them knew cause or just impediment why these two persons should not be joined together in holy matrimony, they were to declare it, and this was the first time of asking. The congregation, which knew her now, which had seen her in the home farm with Glanville and at the reading class with the village children, and upon the headland of an evening with her notebook open to the moon, did not stir with the eager scandal of strangers, but with the warm contained satisfaction of neighbours who had decided, privately and some weeks since, that this was as it ought to be. Mrs. Trembath, in the Tregenna pew with her ring of keys quiet under her hand, sat very upright and looked straight before her, and only the faint working of her mouth betrayed her. And Miss Tamsin Carew beside her had no such composure, and beamed frankly at her hymn-book. There was no Eclipse night drama now, no document to dismantle, no quizzing glass lifted and let fall. There was only the slow lawful asking, 3 times over 3 Sundays, and the heroine found in its patience a thing that suited her, for she had always preferred the certainties that were proved by repetition to the thrills that came but once. On the 2nd Sunday Mr. Penhaligon read the banns again, the 2nd time of asking, and on the 3rd Sunday the 3rd, and no impediment was declared. For there was none. Sir Goderic Trevenna was gone these many weeks, defeated and withdrawn, his forged codicil burned to its purpose by the almanac and the parish register and 40 years of a dead man's careful logs, and the country round about had taken its measure of the matter and approved her the more for the manner of her winning. Between the 2nd Sunday and the 3rd the Dowager Duchess of Roseworthy came to call, silver-haired under her fine lace, in plum-grey silk with her lorgnette upon its ribbon, and she did not come to inspect the bride as a dowager of a harder sort might have done, with a cold accounting of acres and connections, but came rather as one enthusiast to another, asking at once and with real eagerness to be shown the great refracting telescope upon its mahogany equatorial mount, and standing a long while in the octagonal observatory, with her kind, shrewd eyes going up the brass tube to the meridian slit, saying that her son had spoken of nothing for a 12-month but the lady who had corrected the printed lunar tables, and that she had thought him very dull upon the subject until she had met the lady herself, and now she found him not dull at all, but only sensible. They took tea in the South Library beneath the place where the great-uncle's portrait now hung above the coal grate, Mr. Jago Tregenna's lean, clever face looking down upon the room he had loved, and the dowager looked up at it and said gently that she was sorry never to have known him. For a man who built such a clock and kept such records must have been a man worth the knowing, and Theodosia answered, with that directness that was her habit, that she had not known him either, in the living flesh, but that she had come to know him very thoroughly through his logbooks and his instruments, and the one letter he had left her, and that she thought, on the whole, this was not the worst way to know a person, since a man's careful work told no lies and flattered no one and concealed nothing of what he truly valued. The dowager liked that answer. One saw that she liked it, and when she went away in her carriage down the cliff road, she pressed the younger woman's gloved hand and said only that her son had chosen well, and that she had not doubted it, but was glad to be sure. The wedding morning came clear and cold and bright, a North Cornish spring morning of the kind that has more light in it than warmth, with the gulls crying about the headland and the sea below the cliff laid out in long bars of pale blue and slate and silver. And the turret clock in its gabled house struck the hours of that morning over the bay as it had struck them for 40 years, its white and gilt dial catching the early sun, its 8-day movement kept now to its true rate by the boy Jory Nankervis, who had wound it the evening before with the great care of one who knew himself trusted. There was nothing of grandeur about the day, nothing of the crush and glitter that a duke's wedding in town would have summoned. It was a parish wedding in a small cliff church, and the heroine had wished it so, and the duke had agreed without a moment's demur, for he was a man who had buried one wife with all the cold pomp the world could muster, and had found no comfort in it, and wanted now only the quiet truth of a thing plainly done before the people who knew them. She was dressed not in any extravagance, but in a gown of fine, pale, dove-grey silk, the half-mourning of her great-uncle, long since put by, with a narrow edging of cream at the throat and a folded fichu of the sheerest muslin, and at her waist, beneath the soft fall of the silk, she wore still upon its thin steel chain the small, open-faced silver pocket-watch that had been her companion through all of it, through the schoolroom and the long coach road west, and the night of the Codicil, and the 40-year log-books, and she would not be parted from it, even upon her wedding day. And the Duke, when he saw it and understood, said nothing but smiled, for he had asked her once already, to show him Jupiter's moons, and knew precisely the sort of woman he was marrying. Mrs. Trembath had dressed her, with Tamsin Carew handing the pins, and the two of them had stood back, at the last, and looked at her in the long glass of the principal bedchamber, with the sea light coming in at the sash, and Mrs. Trembath, who had served at Tregenna Watch 31 years, and had thought, when her old master died, that the place might pass to strangers and ruin, said in a voice not quite steady that Mr. Tregenna would have been a proud man this day, and that she herself was proud, and that there had been no mistress at the watch in all her years to equal this one. And then she recollected herself and her dignity, and busied her hands with a fold of the silk, and Theodosia, who understood her perfectly, only took the housekeeper's hand a moment and pressed it, and said that she could not have done any of it without her, which was no more than the plain truth. They walked down to the church together, the household and the bride, down the cliff path in the bright cold morning, with the gorse coming into its first hard gold along the headland, and the sea booming soft and far below, Mr. Glanville the steward going before in his best brown frock coat, with his grey side whiskers brushed, Jory in a new jacket walking very straight and conscious of his honour, the maids and the farm people following, and the village of Porthandrea turned out along the way and at the Lich Gate to see her pass, the fisher folk and the cottagers and the children of the reading class, and they did not cheer in any rowdy fashion, but stood and watched her go by with their caps off and their faces warm, for she had become theirs in the months since the autumn, the lady from up at the watch who knew the names of the stars, and had beaten the fat cousin at the law, and taught their boys to read, and tended the great clock that ruled their hours, and they were glad of her, and their gladness was a quiet and a solid thing, the best kind. Within the church, Mr. Penhaligon waited at the chancel step, his ink-stained fingers folded over the open prayer-book, his mild dark eyes upon the door, and beside him stood the Duke of Roseworthy, tall and composed in his deep charcoal superfine over the dove-grey waistcoat, the white cravat folded neat at his throat, his dark brown hair brushed back with its touch of grey at the temples, and he was not pale with nerves nor flushed with triumph, but stood in the patient stillness that was the whole of his nature, watching her come up the aisle on Mr. Glanville's arm with an expression that was very close to wonder, and yet entirely calm, the look of a man who has waited a long while for a thing he was never quite certain he should be granted, and has been granted it. The Dowager Duchess sat in the foremost pew in her plum-grey silk, with her lorgnette in her lap, and her kind, shrewd eyes were bright. Mr. Raisbury had come from Truro for the day, the quiet legal anchor of the whole affair, in his plain black superfine with his gold-rimmed spectacles, the man who had read her the will in the schoolroom a half-year since, and steadied her case against the forgery, and he sat very still and attentive, and looked beneath his gravity, deeply content, as a man does who has seen a matter through from a sealed letter to a happy end. The service was the old plain service, unhurried in Mistard. Penhaligon's mild voice, the words worn smooth by centuries of saying, and Theodosia made her responses clearly and without tremor, for she had considered the whole of what she was undertaking with the same care she gave to every reckoning, and having found it sound, she did not flinch from it. And the Duke made his in his quiet baritone that filled the small stone church without ever being raised. And when he put the ring upon her finger, the slim gold band beside the cool steel chain at her waist, the turret clock in its gabled house above the church, struck the half-hour out across the bay, clear and true and exactly upon its time, as though the great-uncle's own life's work had spoken its blessing over the pair of them. And Theodosia heard it, and understood it, and felt. For the first time that morning, the prick of tears at her eyes, not for grief, but for the great quiet rightness of the thing, that the stars and the clock and the cliff and the man should all be hers and she theirs, lawfully and forever, and that the stranger relative she had been taught to think a family fiction had reached out of his careful records and his 40 years of looking at the sky, and had given her, in the end, not merely a house and a telescope and a famous clock, but a whole life of the precise shape that fitted her, as a well-cut key fits a lock it was filed for. They came out of the church into the bright, cold noon man and wife, and the bells of St. Sonara rang, and the people of Porthandrea threw no rice in the town fashion, but only stood and smiled, and the children ran along beside, and the household walked back up the cliff path to a wedding breakfast laid in the south library, and the long parlour plain good country fare, and there was warmth in that house that day, such as Mrs. Trembath said afterward it had not held in all her 31 years. And the spring came on at Tregenna Watch after the wedding, the true Cornish spring, and it is in that spring that we may best take our leave of her. For she did not go away to be a duchess in some great cold seat inland and leave the cliff to the gulls and the damp. That had never been the bargain. And the Duke had understood it from his first Tuesday call, that the woman he wanted was bound to this headland and these stars, and would not be transplanted from them, and being a sensible man who had a good seat of his own a half-day's ride distant and no objection to 2 homes, he had agreed without argument that Tregenna Watch should remain hers, and they should keep it and dwell there much of the year. And so it was. And in the spring of that year she stood in the walled garden set back from the cliff edge, with her plain grey wool put off for a stout apron, and her sleeves turned back, and good dark earth on her cream gloves laid by upon the wall, and she planted with her own hands the beds that had grown rank in the great-uncle's last solitary years. Sweet William and stocks, and a row of espaliered fruit against the warm south granite, and lavender along the path, and she worked at it through the long light evenings with Tamsin Carew beside her, and Mrs. Trembath bringing out tea, and the smell of turned earth and salt and green things growing was about the place, and the gulls wheeled white over the wall against the pale blue, and the sea breathed below. The great refracting telescope kept its watch in the octagonal observatory, and on clear nights she climbed still to the observing cap, and turned the slow brass to the meridian slit, and read the transits, and entered them in the register in her even hand, continuing the long unbroken line of her great uncle's looking. 40 years, and now more. And the boy Jory came and learnt the stars from her as he had learnt the clock, and Tamsin learned to keep the register against the nights the mistress was from home. The Duke, for his part, settled into the rhythm of the place with the easy grace of a man who had wanted exactly this and no other thing, and it was a quiet pleasure to her and to the whole household to watch how little he required of pomp and how much he found in plainness. He rose early and walked the headland with Mr. Glanville in the dewy mornings, the two of them going slow along the cliff with the wind in their coats, while the steward told him the matter of the home farm, the lambing and the hay, and the state of the boundary walls. And the Duke listened and asked sensible questions, and did not once let it be seen that he had 10 such farms of his own, and need not have troubled. For he had learned long since that to share a man's care is to honour it. He sat of an afternoon in the South Library with a book or with the county papers, in a worn leather chair that had been the great-uncle's. Beneath the great-uncle's portrait, and he did not find the arrangement strange, but rather fitting, that the man whose place he now in some sense filled should look down upon him. And once he raised his glass of an evening to the lean, clever painted face, and said, half in jest and half not, that he was obliged to the old fellow, very deeply obliged, for the best gift one man ever handed to another, without the two of them ever meeting. And Theodosia, hearing it from the writing table, looked up and found that her husband had understood the whole of it, the whole strange, tender chain of it, and loved him the better for it. But it was at the telescope that she came to know him truest, for he had not asked that first Tuesday to be shown Jupiter's moons as a mere pretext of courtship, as a lesser man might have done who cared nothing for the sky but only for the lady beside it. He had asked because he truly wished to see them, and he saw them. And the wonder of it had not worn thin in him with marriage. On the clear nights of that spring they climbed together to the observing cap of the octagonal tower, up the narrow stair with a single shielded candle, and she opened the slate roof to its slow grinding turn, and swung the meridian slit to the south, and set the great brass refractor, and bid him put his eye to it. And he looked. And there hung the bright planet, small and round and banded faint, and strung beside it in a neat diminishing line its 4 points of attendant light, the Galilean moons that Galileo himself had watched and reckoned, and the Duke of Roseworthy, a grown man of 37, who had seen courts and parliaments and the burying of a wife, drew in his breath at it like a boy, and said low that he should never grow used to it, never in his life, that a man might stand upon a Cornish cliff in the dark and reach with a tube of brass clean across the gulf of heaven and count the moons of another world. And she, beside him in the dark, with her notebook open and her pencil ready, and the cold sea wind moving the loose strands at her temple, said that this was precisely how she had always felt, from a girl, and that it was the chief reason she had never been lonely in all her solitary schoolmistress years. For who could be lonely with the whole turning sky for company? And they would time the transits together then, he reading the regulator clock against the north wall, and calling the seconds in his quiet baritone, while she watched the star cross the wire, the two of them working as smoothly as if they had done it 100 years, and she would enter the figures in the long register beneath her great-uncle's hand and her own, the unbroken line going on. And the lamp would gutter low, and the turret clock would strike the small hours out across the sleeping bay, and it was, she thought, as near to perfect happiness as the careful sort of person is permitted to come, which is to say, a happiness built not upon any single transport, but upon 1,000 fitted certainties, each one proved, and each one kept. And in the South Library, above the coal grate where the sea view sash let in the changing light, the portrait of Mr. Jago Tregenna hung and looked down. The lean, clever, kindly face of the stranger who had chosen her sight unseen, who had read in a county paper of a schoolmistress that corrected the printed lunar tables, and had known, with the certainty of one craftsman recognizing another across a distance of years, that the stars were safe with her, and the clock was safe with her, and the whole of his life's careful work would be carried on and not let fall, and she would look up at him sometimes from the writing table where she did the quarter-day accounts, and where the Duke had once sat to draft his plain proposal, and she would think that she had come to love him, this man she never met, with a real and settled love. The loved one bears a benefactor whose gift was not money but understanding, and over it all the turret clock stood in its gabled house, with its white and gilt dial bright above the bay, kept true to the second by the boy and the mistress between them, and it struck the hours of every day and night across the water of Porthandrea, as it had struck them for 40 years and would strike them. Please God for 40 more, and the fisher folk set their going out and their coming in by it, and the village ordered its days by it, and on a still spring evening with the light going lilac and gold over the sea, and the first stars pricking out clean and unshadowed in a clear, unclouded sky, the great movement gathered itself, and struck the hour out long and slow and true, over the dark cliff, and the quiet house and the lit observatory, and the new planted garden, and the woman who had won and kept it all, not by tears, nor by rescue, nor by any man's hand, but by her own composure, and the law and the patient stars, and the estate was hers, and the clock was hers, and the stars were hers, and so they would remain. If this story warmed you, if you found in Theodosia's quiet courage and her hard-won peace a little comfort against the dark, then do stay a while with us. Settle in, rest easy, and let the gentle hours carry you. Subscribe and ring the bell so another tale of dignity, of patience, and of the quiet triumph of a good heart will find its way to you when next the lamp is lit. From all of us here, sleep softly, dream gently, and remember that the steady asking, the careful keeping, and the unhurried truth will, in the end, win the day. Good night.